All right, so our next presentation is from Corey Schmidt of University of Georgia, who will be presenting Pathfinding Toward ArcLight, the journey to discover our next website framework. In 2023, the UGA libraries reaffirmed the decision to implement ArcLight as the next framework for their publicly available finding aid website. In this presentation, Corey will dive into the factors that help make this decision, including their analysis between using the ArchivesSpace public user interface versus ArcLight and the next steps of this project. So Corey, over to you.
Thank you so much, Jessica. Yeah, and thank you everybody for uh, coming to the virtual forum and for giving me a platform to talk about our journey. So yeah, I'll go ahead and get started, and we'll go ahead and do that. So the outline for the presentation is I first want to give a brief history of our archival management practices here at the UGA libraries, specifically looking at the Hargret and Russell libraries, since that those two are the main libraries that we'll be focusing on for the website. Then I'm going to actually give a timeline of the project because it is a rather long project and it's taken over a couple years now. So giving some context about how we arrived at our decision. And then getting into some of the decision-making factors as to why we chose ArcLight over the ArcSize PUI, for instance, looking at things like the customizability, maintainability, and the user experiences of both frameworks. And then lastly, what does it take to implement ArcLight, and giving hopefully some of you, if you are interested in implementing it yourself, some ideas about what it might take. So back in 2019, the Hargret and Russell libraries were using two separate instances of Archivist Toolkit as their archival management system, and they decided that they wanted to migrate to ArchivesSpace. And as a result of that, they hired me as a project manager to manage the migration of those two instances. And I'm happy to report that at the end of 2020, we successfully migrated into ArchivesSpace. But and in addition to that project, we also wanted to unify two separate finding aid websites that both the Harger and Russell libraries were standing up currently at that time into one. So they wanted to merge Hargret's finding aid website and Russell's finding aid website into one. Both of them were using what's called Extensible Text Framework, or XTF, as sort of their framework for their website. That was originally built out at the California Digital Library. And when we had created these two independent websites, we pulled from California Digital Library's core code back in 2012, 2013, and we had been customizing both pretty much until we unified them in 2020, 2021. And by the beginning of 2021, we had successfully unified both Harger and Russell finding aid websites into one using XTF. But during that process, we kind of realized, wow, this is really old code. And while it was very familiar with a lot of our users, and we had made some uh, really interesting customizations to make the process a little easier, more intuitive for users and our own faculty and staff, we realized that it was just it was hanging on by a thread, and we're still using it. So it's hanging on by a thread, and we even had library IT come knocking on our door and say, hey, you're facing deprecation warnings here. You might want to consider moving off onto something else. So those those concerns really pushed us into researching what might be the next step for our finding aid website. So beginning in around January of 2021, we started investigating what different frameworks existed out in the archives world. We sent a survey to ArchivesSpace users asking them what kind of finding aid frameworks they were using. And the results of that survey were that 60% of people were using the ArchivesSpace PUI, which makes perfect sense. There were a few institutions back then who were on ArcLight already, and there were a lot of other institutions who were either using some sort of homegrown local system, a local website, or they were sending their finding aids to aggregators. So we got that information. We also had our own people at Hargreaves Russell Libraries look at the different implementations of the ArchivesSpace PUI and ArcLight that various institutions had set up during that time, and they reported back on what things they liked and what things they didn't like. And we also did a little bit, just a little bit of user testing. Uh, and all that to say, we compiled all this information and we chose ArcLight to replace XDF. And then in June of 2021, we started development work with two in-house developers, one system administrator, and a project manager. And at that time, we were starting with ArcLight version 0.5. So we started developing, we started making a bunch of customizations, building in our features and all that stuff. But unfortunately, January of 2022, our main developer left UGA. So the project at that point stalled, and we kind of hit this break point where we're just like, okay, well, we've got something, we've built some code, but it's not quite ready to be released yet. So let's put the brakes on for a moment. But while we were putting on the brakes, actually the ArcLight community was stepping on the gas, and they started to host bi-monthly community calls hosted by Stanford University. And the end result of that was actually them releasing ArcLight version 1.0 by April of 2023. So in between that time where we stopped development and up until now, where we're actually starting development again, uh, ArcLight had gained a lot more steam as far as community involvement and updating the core code. In March of 2023, we were lucky enough to hire a developer, and in 2023, we were looking at how the ArcLight community was moving, and we reevaluated our decision whether or not to stick with ArcLight or move to something like the ArchivesSpace PUI, especially since 2 years had gone by and both had been updated. But by November of 2023, after talking with a bunch of different groups, stakeholders, dev team, and our own library administration, we agreed that we wanted to move forward with ArcLight. And I'm happy to report that in February of this year, we have started work implementing ArcLight um, and setting up our own instance of that using ArcLight 1.0, and we're doing it with two in-house developers, a system administrator, and a project manager, if that sounds familiar. And we hope to have something released by December of 2024. So with that context out of the way, why did we choose ArcLight? And specifically, why did we choose ArcLight over something like the ArchivesSpace PUI? So hopefully these next few slides will give you a little glimpse into our decision-making process. One of the big factors that we looked at uh, the two uh, between the two frameworks was the customizability of each. We identified that for ArcLight, we would be able to build features the way we wanted them to be built. And that was critical, especially when we were talking about something like integrating Aeon requesting. We use Aeon for our collection management here, and for requesting, researchers request it and that kind of stuff. So that is a critical function. We would not be able to do our jobs without that, and we wouldn't be able to do our jobs without a finding aid website that wouldn't have that functionality. And the way ArcLight is set up, ArcLight by default does not have any Aeon integration. So that's not great. But we noticed that different institutions, such as Duke University and eventually University of Michigan, they were able to make Aeon work and work in really interesting and sometimes really close ways to how we wanted it to work. So what we identified specifically looking at that that feature set that we wanted to build out, that ArcLight would be really great for building something the way we wanted it to, which is being able to request a bunch of different boxes from a collection all at once, and to minimize the time it takes to do that. versus something like the ArchivesSpace PUI, where you have a great plugin, the Aeon Request plugin, um, and I think we identified it works really well, but it doesn't work exactly in the way we wanted it to. And when we compared different institutions that use the Aeon Request plugin to something like what we could build ourselves, we identified that we'd really prefer it to build something ourselves because it would save us so much time in the way we would structure how the website was laid out. And that gets into the second bullet point of uh, how we wanted to change collection layouts so that users could easily see what's in an inventory and be able to click request box 185, request box 199, that kind of thing. So, we realize that there are a lot of great out-of-the-box solutions for the ArchivesSpace PUI, and recent updates with digital objects, make looking at finding those a lot easier for the ArchivesSpace PUI, especially with the inclusion of thumbnails being present. But again, we kind of defaulted back to that mindset of, wow, we really want to do it this way. Like we want to do it in a different way, and that would diverge from how the ArchivesSpace PUI does it. So ultimately, at the end of the day, when we were weighing both of them, um, we really had some specific expectations of how we wanted things to work, and we thought that ArcLight would be a better candidate for making those changes as opposed to working with the ArchivesSpace PUI, which would be more out of the box, and we would have to sort of retrofit our own processes and change our own processes in order to match those expectations. The second point that we looked at was the maintainability of both systems. So ArcLight, we're actually really lucky to have in-house expertise with Blacklight and Ruby on Rails. So for anybody who isn't familiar, ArcLight is built using Blacklight. It is a Blacklight gem, and Blacklight is great because it's very well supported, especially in cultural heritage sector. So there's a lot of great information. It's being regularly updated. And we've got developers who know how to work with it, who have built lots of Blacklight apps. And they've also worked with Ruby on Rails web applications. So for us, this was actually a really big win for being able to identify, okay, which one would we be able to sustain? We did look into hiring an external vendor for development. We talked with Indiana University, who went down that route. Ultimately, we didn't do that for two different reasons. One is because we were hesitant to uh, hire an external developer to make code and then have us maintain that code ourselves. It's much more difficult to maintain someone else's code than it is your own. So that was one hesitation we had. Another hesitation was that we ran out of money. We had a pot of money and we needed to use it for something else. So sorry if if any of the developers are on this chat. Uh, that's kind of what happened. But another point that we liked about ArcLight, but it's also a bit of a con as well, is that it is an entirely separate system from ArchivesSpace. So what that means is we can continue to update ArchivesSpace completely independently from our Finding website, and vice versa. We can update ArcLight without having to change anything with ArchivesSpace. And so that actually works well because we can sort of maintain both systems and keep them both up to date without having too much conflict between that. But you have to maintain two different systems now. So that is a little more unfortunate. And lastly, we are less certain of ArcLight's future. We know that it's being supported by big universities, Stanford, University of Michigan, Duke, Indiana, and a host of others. But it doesn't have the same organizational or community support that ArchivesSpace has, right? ArchivesSpace is hosted or is part of the organizational home of Lyrasis. Um, ArchivesSpace is receiving regular updates supported by a very robust community. Um, on the other hand, if we were to try and customize the ArchivesSpace PUI to make it fit with our own expectations, that would mean it would make it more difficult to sustain our local changes and our local customizations because we found that other institutions that did heavily customize their PUI, they some of them got stuck on very old versions of ArchivesSpace for very long periods of time, and we wanted to avoid that if it was possible. So uh, we kind of looked at both scenarios and we leaned more toward ArcLight mainly because we do have the in-house expertise and because it's a separate system, so we're able to sustain it without affecting our ArchivesSpace instance. Lastly, talking very briefly about the user experience, we did a little bit of user testing in 2021 where we took researchers and they looked at ArcLight without any customizations and the ArchivesSpace PUI without any customizations. And generally, they found it easier or feeling a bit more comfortable to work in ArcLight. They liked the feel of ArcLight a little more. It felt a little bit more modern than the ArchivesSpace PUI. There were also some features about ArcLight that they really liked. There were more filters in search results, and the search results themselves were a bit easier to understand. However, there were things that the ArchivesSpace PUI did really well. The initial search for the ArchivesSpace PUI had a lot more options and was a bit easier to understand. Um, there was content content layout was a little easier. I believe on the right-hand side, there's like a table of contents in the ArchivesSpace PUI that users actually found pretty intuitive to use to find nested items within collections. But eh, looking at both, there were pros and cons to each. Some features were better in one framework than the other. Um, if you want a really deep dive into those pros and cons, I would highly recommend checking out Duke's own evaluation of both platforms. It is a bit dated, right? That was done around 2020, 2021, I believe, when they were starting to implement their ArcLight instance, but it really does a great job of breaking down feature set by feature set what each platform does. So highly recommend you checking that out. So user experience, again, we kind of found that users tended to slightly prefer ArcLight, but it really was close. You could go either way, and there were features about both frameworks that were good. So I'll end very quickly with if you're considering implementing ArcLight, you're looking at it thinking, hey, should we give this a shot? This is kind of what we're doing. So this might give you an idea of what it takes to implement ArcLight. Right now, we have a dedicated development team and project team. So we have two developers, in-house developers, doing the coding. We have one system administrator who has helped set up our code repository and helps manage all of that, the deployment of the website. One project manager who is myself, and I kind of act as the go-between between development team and system administrator and the primary stakeholders, those primary stakeholders being faculty and staff from the Hargret and Russell libraries who take a look at issues, they look at, updates and they say, yes, I like that. No, I don't like that. Can we change that? And that sort of thing. We expect it to take about a year for development. Our developers are working on other things on top of this, so it's not completely full time. So your mileage may vary depending on how much time you're able to get from your development team, if you have a development team at all. So that is something to consider. Another thing to consider is the time it takes to create feature requirements and document user needs. It took around 4 to 6 months to create our initial list of all the different features, changes that we wanted to make in ArcLight. Um, we wrote those up as Google Docs, and we put them as issues in GitLab for our code management and documentation. And then we reevaluated all of those issues again in 2023, 2024. So that was great fun to rehash all that documentation. But ultimately, too, I just want to mention help from the community. The ArcLight community has been extraordinarily essential. We've talked with implementers, developers from many different institutions. We've been regularly involved with the community calls that they continue to host. So if you are interested or uh, looking into ArcLight as your next framework, highly recommend getting involved with the community. They have a Code for Lib Slack channel that is very active. They have a Google group and those community calls, which of course anybody is welcome to attend. And ultimately, at the end of the day, we hope to push some of our own code to core, to ArcLight core code, um, where we think it would be beneficial for the whole community. And that is my presentation. Thank you so much. I hope I came in at time and maybe have a little bit of time for questions. But if you'd like to email me for more information, there's a lot I left out. You can email me at corey.schmidt@uga.edu. And thank you so much for your time. Greatly appreciate it.
Thank you, Corey. Yeah, if you left a lot out, that just means that there's a part 2 at the next forum, right? We'll hear once you launch at the end of the year, we'll need to hear more. To that end, we do have one question in the Q&A already. We have 3 minutes for Q&A. So if you have some questions, please feel free to pop them in. Emily asks, do you plan to do any additional user testing before launch?
We hope so. We have not. I need to reevaluate our timeline to see if we can fit that in. We unfortunately kind of sort of lost our user experience librarian. And by lost, I mean he got promoted, so that was great. But that also means that we're a bit hamstrung for like local expertise in doing user testing. But I really hope that we can maybe scrap something together so that we have some data to report on to make that before we go live.
Gotcha. Thanks. Sarah says, you may have mentioned this and I missed it, but how many developers are working on your ArcLight implementation right now?
There are two. One of them is more or less like a full-time developer, and the other one is half developer, half manager. So we that's how many people we're working with. Um, and yeah, they're on other projects, so getting their time can be a bit tricky, which is why, we've given ourselves a year. But yeah.
Thanks. All right. No other questions are popping up in the Q&A, but of course, if you have one, feel free to drop it in and maybe Corey can text an answer or type an answer via text. But we're going to go ahead and take our break. We're going to break for 10 minutes. But Corey, thank you so much. It was really interesting to hear your thoughtful review process and how you came to that decision. It was really interesting and very helpful, and definitely probably will require a follow-up. Definitely, probably. All right, we're going to go ahead and take a break.